The history of this nation is plagued with many shameful acts of violence, hatred, and discrimination towards racial minorities. Millions of African Americans were shipped from Africa to become the backbones upon which this nation was built upon. As slaves, they were systematically raped, whipped, and psychologically damaged beyond repair. The horrors didn't end, though, upon Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that freed all slaves. Jim Crow laws further systematically prevented any black American from being recognized as equal to their white brothers.
I tried to lean inside and get me a cup of water. And those white people beat me till I was unconscious. They thought I was dead.
Even in the more tolerant North, the attitude towards the African Americans were shaky at best.
When we express doubt concerning the ability of the white man to solve our problem, and also when we express doubt concerning his integrity, concerning his sincerity, because you will have to confess that the problem has been around here for a long time, and whites have been saying the same thing about it for the past 100 years, and it's no nearer a solution today than it was 100 years ago.
After a long and arduous battle led by revolutionaries like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Thurgood Marshall, the Jim Crow laws were declared unconstitutional, and the landmark passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 guaranteed equality for members of all races from then on. But fast forward to modern day. It would seem that we have broken all racial barriers that prevented the previous generation from rising to the top. Our nation's highest seat of leadership, wildly successful entrepreneurs, Grammy Award-winning artists, are African American. People have friends from all different sorts of ethnic groups. Many would assert today that not only have we moved beyond the dark waters of our racial forefathers, but American society in itself has graduated to an advanced and modern position. The members of that advanced and sophisticated society, and by extension nearly the entire population, believe that anyone can enjoy upward social mobility from a lower class of life to a higher one, no matter what your background, family history, economic standing, or racial profile. In fact, a myth has settled down like a cloud upon the American population, a mythology that millions take part in every day. Racism and its effects no longer play any part in determining one's eventual success of land, liberty, and happiness. After all, don't we live in a race-free utopia? No. Racism and the effects of it continue to plague the minority communities to this day. The fight to the ideal world is far from over. As wonderful as this myth might be on the outside, it's inflicting damage upon the backs that this dominating myth infringes upon. It hinges on the idea of a post-racial society, one in which race can no longer be disadvantageous in obtaining admissions to college, obtaining a job, or living a happy, healthy, and productive life. People often token the entire African American population to be represented by that one successful friend, or that one successful politician, entrepreneur, etc., when in reality, they make the exceptions, not the rule. If you take a look at the history of this nation, you will see that even after the institution of slavery was abolished, institutional racism continued to plague the population. Institutional racism is racism that exists within the way that institutions such as the government and education function on a day-to-day basis. Redlining, for example, was a major way in which African Americans were systematically discriminated, greatly affecting the way that they live today. The Housing Act of 1961, for example, provided $5 billion for urban renewal and new housing construction. At the time, John F. Kennedy believed in creating new homes and suburbs to put people to work and create the homogeneous, pristine American lifestyle. However, the downside was that the act blatantly refused to offer those subsidies to people who lived in the black urban neighborhoods, fearing with a prejudiced assumption that African Americans wouldn't be responsible enough to pay back the mortgage and the like. Those houses constructed under the Housing Act were then offered exclusively to the white population. The houses that back then went for $30,000 are now worth over $300,000. This was an opportunity that African Americans and other minorities were denied back then, opportunities and wealth that they missed out on. Discriminatory actions such as this are ways in which wealth has collected and remained in the hands of the white population. Another crucial way society is maintaining the suppression of the growth of the African American population is exemplified in the education system and the way that it is funded. The fact that the quality of education in a particular neighborhood is based on property taxes means that the poorer urban inner city wouldn't receive funding for higher quality education. Because education is one of the largest factors that affect further income brackets, this method hardly allows residents of urban areas the chance to climb the social ladder. It creates a spiral of destructive darkness that keeps people in and contained. Those in poverty are then not offered the same opportunities in banking, insurance, healthcare, and even access to supermarkets for upward social mobility as those who live in the more pristine neighborhoods. It is easy to see why studies have shown that if a child grew up in poverty, he or she would likely to end up in poverty themselves as adults. As much as we love to hear the rags to riches stories of people like Chris Gardner, Michael Oher, Oprah, and Barack Obama, stories like that are rarely repeated. Therefore, it is not by coincidence that the percentage of African Americans who currently live in poverty is more than double that of the percentage of whites who live in poverty, or the fact that African Americans make up 25% of those in poverty when they only constitute 13% of the population, or that incarceration rates are highest among Black and Latino men, or that the highest paying jobs continue to be disproportionately dominated by white men. Politicians and government agencies have developed the tendency to talk about poverty in the more sanitized, politically correct terms of income distribution, due to the unacknowledged and ugly history of race in this country and its legacy in the creation of poverty. The dominant political discourse has removed race, gender, and ethnicity from the equation, when the fact remains that poverty in this country is founded upon the marginalization and disenfranchisement of specific communities in our society. Black and Latino and other minorities have been institutionally and historically under-resourced, neglected, and exploited for their labor. Poverty in the U.S. is founded on histories of labor extraction which date back to the time of slavery. It is founded on immigration and employment policies. It is founded on housing policies which exclude certain groups and lump others together. It is founded on law enforcement, the war on drugs, and many more. Society as a whole was the one who systematically screwed over the African Americans for centuries, yet that same society expects the infringed upon communities to be the one to fix the mess that they did not create.
So how does a myth as widespread as this one settle upon the population? Well, this myth primarily operates in two ways: guilt and shame from the past, and a superiority complex over the unbounding opportunities afforded by America. As a high and functioning modern society, we'd like to think that we've graduated from any of the abhorrences of the past. Nearly every person living in the United States is aware of the horrors of slavery that took place on this land and the blatantly racist laws heralded by the American government of the Jim Crow law era. But nobody wants to be associated with those racist acts of the past. But within every person lies a degree of guilt or shame for the acts institutionally committed against the African American population. But the dicey part comes when you realize that the same free nation that we're enjoying living off of today is the same one that also persecuted and oppressed millions of African Americans and minorities. That can be no argument. Stemming from an intense guilt for what happened then, people don't want to entertain the very real notion that the issue of racism hasn't completely left the American playing field, that we haven't managed to discard the centuries worth of racism from this society, that the racism that we're so ashamed of today could still be playing today on the African American and minority population. It's easy and more comfortable for them to believe that there is no issue. And to amend for it, and to distance themselves from the guilt of what the nation has done to these people, they make sure other people know that they themselves were not part of the society that attacked the minorities.
Most people that know me would tell you that I am the least racist. I've had great relationships. In fact, Randall Pinkett won on the, as you know, on The Apprentice a little while ago, a couple of years ago, and Randall's been outstanding in every way. So, I mean, I am the least racist person.
And even though they may be uncomfortable to actually voicing this opinion, the cause of the racial population is irrelevant to them. And they don't make any effort to educate deeper in how race plays an effect on these lives today, because as far as they know, they're not practicing racism, and nobody they know are active racists. So they have no business saying that it is real or not. Because if they allowed that thought to be true, it would bring to fruition the unpleasant and uncomfortable idea that they are still part of the society that infringes upon an entire group of people. So therefore they distance themselves from the issue, call it a non-issue, and say that race plays no effect on the lives of people today.
So on the topic of racism, people are always talking about racism. We study so much about racism in class, and personally, I'm not racist at all. Nobody I know is racist at all. So I really don't see why it's so relevant today if people are being less and less racist, and I just don't think we should be spending so much time in class learning about racism, something that's just in the past.
Now, the second half of this myth rests on a superiority complex that is gained from an even larger myth, the so-coveted American dream. This myth has been ingrained in the fabric of American society since the creation of this nation. Escaping the shackles of an oppressive England, our founding fathers created a nation in which freedom rang throughout the streets. And no, this was a country that anybody had the opportunity to become wealthy and strike the American dream. Millions immigrated onto the shores of this land with the hope that they could make it big. All you needed was hard work and dedication. And so this belief has prevailed throughout the traditional American lifestyle. Behind this seemingly optimistic paradigm of a racist-free society lies a darker myth that threatens to impede upon the growth of the African American population. See, the counterside to this myth is that anyone who hasn't reached fiscal success is to be blamed because they are the ones that lack the hard work and dedication. Those who sit on top of the corporate world look down at those below, possessing a superiority complex in which they believe they're better than those in the lower class because they've worked harder, longer, and better for their rightly deserved position. They would claim there is no excuse for being poor, no excuse that everybody isn't as well off and successful as they are. The same dismissive attitude people have for the homeless are then generally used upon the minority population who haven't managed to attain the same level of socially acceptable success. And they disregard all of the factors that have led someone to be at that stage, such as their race, their family history, and centuries of prejudice acting against them. Now these people would further actively protest against any help that is provided to members of the once persecuted race.
Just as this hateful man has.
But if only sick, phony people who go around inventing it because they need an issue so that they could stay out of work, pretend they're crusading about something important that doesn't exist, and invent it so that they shouldn't have to go to work. Go to work and stop lying to people about racism in this country. Thank God we've defeated it. And if it exists, it has no excuse to make such an issue out of it that you have to spend your time looking for it. Look for something productive, but that would require a job, and that's not for you. Thank God it's a great democracy, and thank God we proved it now because we have a black president.
Another example of this mythology expressed in society is the protesting of affirmative action. Now, affirmative action essentially allows race to be one of the factors for college admissions, along with marital qualifications. This was vehemently protested by the Republican Club and the University of California, Berkeley by a bake sale, which trivialized the arduous plight of all of those minorities at the hands of the American society. It would seem that we as a society has surpassed any inklings of racial inequalities, and the struggle for marginalized racial communities is over. But this thinking is far from true. This destructive myth threatens to stagnate the growth of the population of the African American, the entire population, and not just the fate of the more successful ones. As the thoughts and ideals continue to exist, forcing these myths to remain in place, the possibilities for growth has diminished. This mythology that is deeply woven into the fabric of society needs to be exposed for what it truly is, if the redemption of the marginalized minorities can be restored in this land of the endless opportunities.